If you were to dig through the cold, gray silt of the Pendrite Valley today, your spade would eventually strike iron. It would not be the clean, polished iron of a museum display. It would be a mangled mass of crushed chainmail, rusted solid, fused with the splintered remains of a dark Battanian oak shield. If you look closely at this specific piece of metal, you can see how it died. The individual iron rings are not simply broken. They are twisted inward, sheared by a sudden, immense downward force that punched through the mail, through the boiled leather beneath it, and deep into the collarbone of the man wearing it. That man was Tiberius, a veteran of the Imperial 5th Legion, a professional soldier whose entire life was governed by the cold, predictable logic of the empire. Tiberius believed in the silver denar. He believed in the perfect geometry of the shield wall. He believed that if you paid enough money to the smelters of Lycaron, and if you drilled men to stand shoulder to shoulder with their shields locked, there was no force on Calradia that could break you. But Tiberius was dead long before the sun set on that misty morning in 1077. And his death was not an accident of war. It was the mathematical result of an empire that had grown so large, so rich, and so confident in its administrative systems that it forgot the physical reality of the ground it stood upon. Emperor Arenikos did not see the mud when he drafted his campaign plans in the warm marble halls of Onira. He saw maps. He saw lines of supply. He saw a ledger that recorded exactly 42,000 bushels of barley, 6,000 iron horseshoes, and the wages of 3,000 elite Vlandian mercenary lances. To Arenikos, military campaign was an exercise in bookkeeping. If the empire spent enough gold, mobilized enough iron, and drafted enough men, victory was a simple calculation. But the silver mines of Diathma were running thin. The grain fields of the south were already choking under a 3-year drought. The empire could not afford a long, dragging war of attrition in the northern forests. It needed a quick, decisive, crushing victory to prove to the Senate and the rebellious factions that the throne was still absolute. And so, Arenikos ordered his massive war machine north, directly into the rugged, broken hills of Battania. He did not send scouts to test the depth of the rivers. He did not ask how a 50-pound suit of iron plate would behave in a wetland. He simply looked at his ledger and assumed that more iron would always beat less iron. This was the first fatal assumption. The empire had spent centuries perfecting the art of fighting on open, dry plains, where their heavy cavalry could sweep the flanks, and their disciplined infantry could grind the enemy down like a slow stone mill. But the North was different. The North was a land of ancient forests, steep ravines, and bottomless peat bogs that had never known the straight lines of an imperial road. As the great column of 15,000 imperial soldiers wound its way through the narrow mountain passes, the land itself began to change. The dry dirt turned to gray clay. The gray clay turned to black mud, and with every mile they marched, the weight of their own armor began to pull them down. Every step became an administrative struggle. The heavy baggage wagons, loaded with iron spears, spare horse barding, and wine for the officers, began to sink to their axles. The draft oxen, exhausted and underfed on the poor mountain scrub, died in their yokes, their carcasses left to rot in the ditches. To keep the army moving, the soldiers were ordered to carry more of their own rations, adding another 20 pounds of grain and salt pork to their already crushing combat load. By the time the Imperial vanguard reached the edge of the Pendraic swamp, they were not a proud, invincible legion. They were a tired, wet, frustrated mass of men who had spent 3 weeks fighting the earth itself, long before they ever saw a single Battanian soldier.
To understand why the Battle of Pendraic happened where it did, one must understand the absolute paralysis of the imperial military mind when confronted with unfamiliar geography. The Roman-style bureaucracy of the Calradic Empire demanded uniform solutions to unique physical problems. If a legionary was trained to dig a trench exactly 4 feet deep, he would dig it 4 feet deep, whether he was on the dry sands of the Asarai Desert or in the saturated peat of the northern marshes. When the army arrived at the Pendraic Basin, they found a wide, flat valley floor that looked to the untrained eye of the southern generals like an ideal battlefield. It was wide enough to deploy a full imperial brigade in a double-layered shield wall, with ample room on the wings for the cataphracts to maneuver. The generals did not notice that the green grass covering the valley was actually a thin, deceptive carpet of moss floating over 6 feet of liquid peat.
They did not understand that the local Battanian clans had spent 3 generations using this swamp as a natural defense, knowing exactly which narrow paths of gravel could support the weight of a man, and which pools of dark water would swallow an armored horse whole. King Errol of the Battanians did not have an office of military ledgers. He did not have scribes counting bushels of wheat. What he had was a deep, intuitive understanding of gravity, moisture, and local iron. He knew that the imperial army was too heavy to retreat, too proud to bypass the valley, and too rigid to change their formation once they had committed to the field. He positioned his clansmen along the high wooded ridges overlooking the basin, keeping them hidden behind the ancient oak trees and thick hazel brush. From this high vantage point, the Battanians could watch the slow, agonizing deployment of the imperial forces. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight. Thousands of men, their brass helmets catches the cold northern sun, their long iron spears aligned in perfect, unbroken rows. The cataphracts rode on massive war horses, both rider and beast covered in heavy scales of steel and bronze that clicked and chimed with every step. To the Imperial High Command, this display of mechanical perfection was a guarantee of victory. Who could possibly stand against this wall of iron? But to the Battanians watching from the trees, it looked like a herd of fat, heavy cattle walking into a slaughterhouse. The logistics of the Imperial Army were already breaking under their own weight. The soldiers had been on half rations of flour for 5 days because the baggage wagons were still stuck 3 miles behind in the clay tracks. The horses of the cataphracts, deprived of proper grain and forced to graze on the sour swamp grass, were suffering from colic and physical exhaustion. The heavy iron armor, designed to shield the rider from arrows, was holding in the cold moisture of the bog, causing the soldiers to shiver constantly and draining their physical reserves before a single arrow had been shot. The imperial system was designed for a short, violent clash on dry ground, followed by a quick retreat to a fortified camp. It was not built to endure the slow, wet, paralyzing reality of a northern autumn. As the morning mist began to rise from the black water, the imperial trumpet sounded the advance. The great wall of iron began to move forward, its boots sinking 3 inches into the mud with every step, unaware that they were stepping into a mechanical trap designed by the very earth itself.
In the front ranks of the imperial shield wall stood Lucian, a veteran legionary of the 5th Triarii. Lucian's hands were raw, chapped by the freezing dampness of his iron scutum's handle. He had spent 20 years holding that shield, trusting its heavy 3-ply wood and central iron boss to deflect everything from desert javelins to Vlandian crossbow bolts. But as he stared through the gaps in the front line, he saw something that made him tighten his grip until his knuckles turned white. Out of the gray fog, walking with a loose, easy stride that suggested complete familiarity with the treacherous ground, came the Battanian Falksmen. They did not wear the heavy, expensive armor of the South. Many wore nothing but rough wool tunics, their legs wrapped in leather thongs, their bare feet gripping the slippery moss with a security that no imperial iron boot could ever match. But in their hands they carried the falx. The falx was not a sword.
It was an agricultural tool redesigned for the harvest of human limbs. To understand the physics of the falx is to understand why the imperial shield wall was suddenly rendered obsolete. The falx was a long, two-handed weapon with a heavy, forward curving blade, sharpened only on the inside edge. It was, in essence, a massive, combat-hardened scythe. When an imperial legionary raised his heavy, rectangular Studum shield to block a blow, he was training to resist a straight, downward chop from a sword or a direct thrust from a spear. The flat surface of the shield would absorb the kinetic energy, and the iron boss would deflect the point. But the falx did not strike like a sword. When a Battanian woodsman swung the falx, he used the rotational torque of his entire torso, pivoting on his hips and transferring the kinetic energy from his broad shoulders down through his forearms. The curved blade did not hit the flat of the shield. It hooked over the top rim. As the curve engaged the wood, the leverage of the long two-handed hilt allowed the wielder to pull downward with immense force, physically dragging the imperial soldier's shield down and exposing his throat, face, and collarbone. If the legionary resisted, holding his shield high with all his muscular strength, the forward-pointing tip of the falx would strike the top of the shield and, due to the curve of the blade, hook behind the shield wall, slicing into the back of his hand, his wrist, or his neck. It was a mechanical bypass of the most successful defensive system in the ancient world. The falksmen did not try to break the shield wall with brute force. They used the shape of their weapon to turn the imperial shield into a handle that they could use to pull their victims forward into the killing space. Behind the Falksmen came the archers, carrying longbows of seasoned yew that could throw an iron-tipped bodkin arrow through a mail link at 70 paces.
They did not fire in grand, synchronized volleys like the Imperial archers.
They stood in small, independent groups among the wet rocks and dwarf pines, selecting individual targets with the cold, methodical precision of deer hunters. They targeted the officers, identifiable by their tall crests and gilded armor, and the unarmored horses of the scouts. The Imperial soldiers, packed together in tight, defensive squares to resist the cavalry charge that would never come, made it impossible to miss target. Every arrow that fell into the dense formation found flesh, sparking a rising wave of panic and confusion among the ranks who were used to fighting enemies who stood and traded blows in the open.
As the Imperial infantry line began to buckle under the relentless pressure of the Falksmen, Emperor Arenikos made the decision that would seal the fate of his army. He ordered his elite cataphracts, the heavy iron fist of the Empire, to charge the Battanian flanks and break their skirmish lines. To Arenikos, this was the classic textbook maneuver. The heavy cavalry would sweep in, ride down the lightly armored foot soldiers, and restore order to the battlefield. He did not consider the physics of the ground. A single, fully armored cataphract, riding a heavy warhorse that was also covered in iron scale barding, carried a total weight of over 600 kilograms. When that immense mass is concentrated on 4 narrow iron horse hooves, the ground pressure exerted on the soil is astronomical, exceeding 80 pounds per square inch. The marshy silt of the Pendrake Basin, saturated by weeks of autumn rain, had a bearing capacity of less than 20.
As the great wall of iron cavalry spurred their horses into a gallop, the disaster unfolded in slow, horrifying motion. The horses did not charge, they sank. With their first strides, the heavy war horses broke through the fragile crust of moss, their hooves plunging knee-deep into the black, sucking peat below. The momentum of the charge was lost instantly. The horses, terrified by their inability to find solid footing, began to thrash and panic, sinking even deeper with every desperate movement. The heavy iron scales that protected them from arrows now acted as an anchor, dragging them down into the liquid silt. The riders, trapped in their heavy plate armor and long iron boots, could not dismount. If they fell from their saddles, they did not land on their feet. They sank to their waists in the cold, thick mud, unable to lift their legs or swing their long lances. The pride of the Kalratic military machine was reduced to a row of half-submerged, helpless metal statues, stuck in the mud like iron pilings driven into a harbor floor. For the Battanian Falksmen, this was not a battle anymore. It was a harvest. They did not charge the cavalry head-on. They moved along the gravel ridges, using their light weight and barefoot agility to dance around the sinking giants. They used the long, curved tips of their falxes to hook the riders by their collar crests or shoulder guards, dragging them from their saddles and into the shallow, bloody water. Once a cataphract was on the ground, his heavy armor made it impossible for him to stand up quickly.
He lay on his back like a flipped beetle, his limbs flailing uselessly, while 2 or 3 clansmen stood over him with short iron daggers, searching for the narrow gaps in his helmet or under his armpits where they could slip the steel into his flesh.
The cold, wet peat of Pendrake became a massive open-air tomb, where the finest steel that imperial gold could buy was systematically buried beneath the mud by men who fought with nothing but iron, wood, and a deep knowledge of their own land. By midday, the center of the imperial line was no longer a formation. It was a churning red vortex of close quarters slaughter, where the elite soldiers of Onira and the wild clansmen of the northern hills were locked in a desperate, muscle-straining struggle for survival. Here, in the deepest part of the swamp, the biomechanics of medieval combat were stripped of all glory and reduced to their rawest, most brutal physical realities. Lord Hurun, a cousin of the Battanian king and a veteran of 40 border raids, led the final charge of the Falksmen. He did not carry a shield. He did not wear a helmet. His face was covered in blue woad paint and dried mud. His massive shoulders bare and glistening with sweat despite the freezing cold. He confronted an imperial tribune, a nobleman who had spent his life practicing the refined, elegant swordsmanship of the capital's academies. The tribune held his long spatha sword in a perfect high guard, his feet planted wide on a patch of semi-solid turf, his muscles coiled like a spring. The duel that followed was not a sequence of graceful parries and lunges. It was a collision of opposing mechanical philosophies. The tribune launched a quick, thrusting strike aimed at Hurun's throat. It was a precise, high-velocity attack designed to slip through the gaps of a defensive shield. But Hurun did not try to parry with steel. He shifted his weight to his rear foot, pivoting his hips backward by a fraction of an inch, allowing the imperial point to slide harmlessly past his chest. In the same motion, Hurun raised his falx, using the momentum of his dodge to bring the heavy, curved weapon up and over his shoulder in a massive diagonal arc. The tribune, realizing his thrust had missed, instinctively raised his left arm, which was wrapped in a heavy bronze arm guard, to deflect the blow. Under normal circumstances, against a standard sword, this defense would have held. But the Falks did not strike with simple cutting force. The weight of the forward curving head, combined with the leverage of Hurun's long two-handed grip, created a terminal velocity that bypassed the bronze protection entirely. The curved inner edge of the falx struck the tribune's arm, the forward-pointing tip hooking behind the bone and slicing through the muscle, tendon, and artery with a sickening, wet crunch. The force of the blow was so immense that it did not just cut, it shattered the underlying ulna and radius, sending the tribune's sword spinning into the mud. Before the imperial officer could scream, Hurun pulled the weapon back with a sudden, violent jerking motion, using the curved blade to drag the tribune's head down toward the earth, exposing the back of his neck. A second, short, downward chop severed the spine, and the nobleman collapsed into the marsh like a sack of wet flour. Around them, the rest of the vanguard was being systematically dismantled. The imperial soldiers, exhausted by the weight of their own armor and the effort of lifting their boots out of the sucking clay, could no longer maintain their guard. Their shoulders burned with lactic acid. Their breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. They could not swing their heavy gladius swords with enough velocity to penetrate the leather wraps of the Battanians, while every swing of the Falksmen, powered by two-handed leverage and the desperation of men defending their homeland, splintered shields and severed limbs with terrifying ease. The battle had ceased to be an organized clash of nations. It had become a meat grinder, powered by the raw, kinetic energy of wood and curved iron against the static, brittle resistance of bronze and chainmail.
As the sun began to sink below the western ridges,
A terrible, heavy silence descended over the Pendrake Valley. The screaming had stopped. The trumpets had grown quiet. The only sound left was the low, rhythmic croaking of the marsh frogs and the wet, heavy flapping of the crows as they landed on the mounds of iron and flesh that dotted the wetland. Emperor Arenikos had survived the battle, pulled from the mud by his personal guard and dragged back to the safety of the southern hills. But the army he had spent 10 years building was gone. 10,000 imperial soldiers lay dead in the peat, their silver coins and bronze armor left to rot in the cold northern dampness. The administrative office in Onira would spend the next 3 months drafting casualty reports, but they would never find the names of all the boys who had died in the swamp. The mathematical certainty of the empire had been broken by the simple, chaotic reality of a wet valley floor and a curved piece of iron.
the Battle of Pendrake was not just a military defeat. It was the moment the illusion of imperial invincibility died forever. The neighboring kingdoms, the Vlandians, the Sturgians, the Kuzites, looked at the empty saddle of the cataphracts and realized that the empire was no longer a colossus to be feared. It was a bloated, heavy, slow-moving beast that could be baited, trapped, and dismantled by anyone with enough courage and a sharp piece of steel. Within a year of the battle, the provincial governors began to withhold their taxes, keeping the silver pennies for their own local garrisons rather than sending them to the empty treasuries of the capital. The Senate split into bitter, warring factions, each blaming the other for the disaster at Pendrake, setting the stage for the massive, catastrophic civil war that would eventually tear Calradia into 3 bleeding fragments.
And in the forests of Britannia, the victory was celebrated not with stone monuments or grand administrative decrees, but with songs sung around the hearth fire in the long winter nights. They sang of King Errol, who had seen through the imperial fog, of Lord Hurun, who had cleaved the bronze titans, and of the Falksmen, who had proven that the earth of the north belonged to no empire. But the songs did not bring back the dead woodsmen. They did not repair the charred villages that the imperial vanguard had burned on their march north. The victory at Pendrake had preserved the freedom of the forest clans, but it had also guaranteed that Calradia would know no peace for the next 100 years. The land was left to bleed, its future as uncertain as the cold, drifting fog that still covers the black waters of the swamp, hiding the bones of the men who believed that iron was stronger than the mud that swallowed them.
The ledgers of Onira counted the cost in gold. The clans of the north counted it in graves. In the end,
both were consumed by the same silent, indifferent mud.